Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm Michael David Fox. I'm director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies here at Georgetown School of Foreign Service, which is hosting this event. And our sponsor is the Carnegie Foundation of New York, Carnegie Corporation of New York. Russia Brief is moderated and organized by Jill Dougherty, our colleague, and I'm happy to introduce her. She is an adjunct professor here at Series at Georgetown. Formerly with CNN, she served in a wide variety of roles, including White House correspondent, State Department correspondent, and Moscow bureau chief. Today, we're very pleased to welcome our colleague Victor Cha to discuss a very important topic, which is the relationship between Putin and Kim and Russia in the current situation. So Jill, I'll let you take it over.
Great. Thank you very much, Michael. Yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting discussion. When we were just talking about it behind the scenes as we plan this, I was thinking, historically, North Korea has been one of the most isolated countries on Earth. It used to be called the Hermit Kingdom, and then George W. Bush labeled it part of the axis of evil. But now, I think arguably, North Korea is a key element in two wars, Ukraine and in Israel. Not fighting directly, but providing weapons and ammunition. And it's also reaping, and this is the bigger picture, reaping military, economic, and diplomatic benefits from those conflicts. And as the North comes out of its shell, we've seen Kim Jong Un travel to Russia for a summit with Vladimir Putin, and the two countries tout their growing partnership. So that's what we're going to be examining today. And as Michael mentioned, we have Victor Cha, one of the world's top experts on North Korea. In fact, he is one of the very few people who has actually directly negotiated with North Korea as former deputy head of the US delegation to the six-party talks and former director for Asian affairs at the National Security Council. He also, I should say, here at Georgetown, he is the distinguished university professor and D.S. Song KF chair in the School of Foreign Service and the Department of Government. And then finally, Victor, I have to plug your new book because it really is great. Korea, New History of South and North. So Victor Cha, welcome.
Thank you very much, Jill. It's great to be with you. And Michael, it's good to see you as well. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Fantastic. Well, just housekeeping here. We'll talk for about a half an hour, and then we will open it up to questions. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of them. And for the audience, you can put those questions in the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. So, Dr. Cha, we actually began our discussion, you could say, about a month ago when you invited me as a guest on your really fabulous podcast for CSIS called The Impossible State. And we explored some of the factors that brought Russia and North Korea closer together. So let's kind of stand back. And for those in the audience, could you give us a big picture? How do you explain this growing, let's start with the military alignment?
Sure, Jill. I'm happy to do that. First, I want to say thank you to you both for hosting me on this program. I've been a big admirer of Jill's throughout the year during her career at CNN. To me, you represent sort of the best of journalism in the sense that you have deep substantive expertise in a very applied fashion, so that the general readership audience can understand what's going on. And that Michael, always grateful for your leadership of series, both the center as well as the MA program. So thank you both. Well, with regard to the relationship, as you know, this goes back for quite some time. If we go all the way back, it goes back to the actual war itself, between North and South Korea, where Stalin basically gave the go-ahead for Kim Il-sung to carry out the invasion of the South, and then played a very important role, behind the scenes, ostensibly not sending ground troops in, but providing a lot of military equipment, training, putting the Chinese out in front, but doing a lot of military equipment, military training, and providing air cover for the North Korean effort. After that, the relationship during the Cold War was one that was very close, where the Soviets provided a security guarantee to North Korea. But this all started to come apart with the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union made the decision to normalize relations with South Korea in 1990. And they didn't abandon North Korea, but they, I would say, they created a more rational relationship with North Korea that caused great economic discomfort, and which eventually led to the famine in the mid-1990s and the problems that North Korea has had since. But the military relationship it's got long and deep roots. The first generation of North Korean military leaders were trained in the Soviet Union, including the second leader of the first leader of North Korea and the second leader of North Korea, who was actually born, right, who was born in the Soviet Union. So their relationship is very deep and very long, and has very deep roots, and has been around for quite some time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's, I think, really important to talk about. You know, more recently, like what we were talking about a month ago, is the nexus right now, because let's begin with Ukraine. We at that point were looking at North Korea providing conventional arms that Russia needs, and then the North needing food, energy, and maybe a lot more when you get into high tech. So I guess the question would be, what are the interests, what are the needs of each party, and what do they get out of it?
Yes, certainly. I mean, what has made it into the news has been really announced by declassifying of intelligence by the White House, is that North Korea is arming the Russians in Ukraine, particularly with ammunition. So if there's one place in the world where there is a stockpile of ammunition, it's on the Korean Peninsula. Both sides are blowing through it in the war in Ukraine right now at amazing rates, and so everybody needs munitions. The Russians are getting it, a lot of it, from the North Koreans, and for the North Koreans, you know, the immediate need is food and fuel, because this transaction is taking place at a time when North Korea is coming out of a 3-year COVID lockdown, where they basically stocked out on everything from medicine to food, to fuel, to energy. And so the immediate need is for those sorts of things. But what made me more concerned in terms of what North Korea's interests are was that we had this sudden news that the North Korean leader was going to Russia, right? He does not travel that often. He doesn't like to take airplanes. He takes a long train ride. He took a long train ride to Vietnam in February of 2019 to meet with Donald Trump. And so that made me worried, because the North Korean leader is not going to take a train all the way to Russia just for food and fuel. Which leads to the concern that what the other interests that North Korea is seeking out of this arms transaction is they're looking for help on other sorts of technology having to do with things like military satellites, potentially nuclear submarines, and long-range ballistic missiles, all of which the North Korean leader has made very clear are items that he is capabilities that he is seeking to achieve. I think for the other things that the North Koreans are also getting out of it is they're looking for debt relief. Historically, there are two things that North Korea has always wanted from Russia, the Soviet Union. One of them is energy at discounted prices, and the other is debt relief. And so they're looking for debt relief from Putin. I think they got that as well. And then the other thing for Kim that he's looking for is a face-saving way out of the failure of the Summitry with Donald Trump. You know, they had 3 summits that reached no agreements. The North Korean leader took the long train ride back from Vietnam when Trump walked out of the meeting, literally walked out of the meeting in Hanoi in February 2019. And then North Korea went into a 3-year COVID lockdown. So they needed a way to come out of this. And this was a very big win for him, right? For the North Korean leader to be able to sit face to face with Putin, to have actually something to offer Putin instead of just always asking for things from Russia, something that the Russians need. And they're going to milk this for as much as they can get out of it.
Yeah. Just on that point, because you know the country very well, or I guess as much as anyone can know it, could you kind of walk us into it a little bit? I have two questions. One would be demographics, because you mentioned COVID. And I'm sure, since there were probably no protocols or any vaccines in the beginning, at least, for the people, there must be a real demographic price that they are paying for that. And I noted that Kim Jong Un, I think it was yesterday, there was some video of him crying about women not having babies. It was really striking. So that's one, demographics. And the other one is the factories, because they must be cranking 24 hours a day, because the weapons, as we can talk about a little bit later, are finding their way not only into Ukraine with the Russians, but also into apparently the Middle East. So could you get into both of those? I think they're really interesting.
Yeah, sure, certainly. So on the demographics, so North Korea, it's estimated, lost 10% of their population in the mid-1990s because of famine. Again, there was a Soviet role in that. Again, as I said, in the sense that in 1990, the Soviets told the North Koreans they were no longer going to provide energy at sort of like communist patron prices, that they had to pay market prices. And North Korean imports of Soviet oil, I think they decreased something like 60% year on year between 1990 and 1991. This triggered an energy crisis in North Korea, which then triggered deforestation in the country, which then led to flooding, which then led to the famine. So they lost 10% of their population there. They are the only, I think, one of two countries that has no vaccination against COVID. They were offered Sputnik vaccine. They were offered Sinovac. COVAX offered them AstraZeneca, a variety of different vaccines, and they said no. They said no to all of them.
I'm surprised about the Russian. Why do you think they said no to Russia?
It's hard to say. I mean, I think their argument was that they know how to lock down their population, unlike the United States or other places. So they used it as an opportunity to criticize the West. I think the other thing was that they didn't trust the vaccines. They really didn't know what was going on. They didn't trust the vaccines. They read that some of them were not effective. In the end, we found out that through their cyber attacks, that what they really wanted after a bit of time, when the mRNA vaccine proved to be the most effective, what they really wanted was that, and they tried to hack Pfizer to get it, to get the vaccine. But anyway, so they're not vaccinated. They already start out from a very low health infrastructure base, in the sense that the public health infrastructure system does not really operate in North Korea. And so they've been deathly afraid of any sort of pandemic. SARS, we had SARS a few years ago, MERS, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, when that hit South Korea a few years ago. They've been very concerned about those sorts of things. So demographically, they're not in a very good position. Their population is half the size of South Korea today. And then, as you said, on the Korean Peninsula, both North and South, there is a birth replacement rate problem. And it's interesting because what you just mentioned about Kim Jong Un talking about this came out just around a little bit after the South Korea. There were reports in South Korea about how South Korea has now the lowest replacement rate in its history and the lowest replacement rate in Asia. Wow. There was, in fact, a New York Times op-ed a week ago that said, "Is South Korea vanishing? Right? Is it disappearing?" So that's on the demographics. In terms of the munitions, what North Korea, I think, is doing is they are giving the Soviets the munitions they have now, and they're getting support and help to produce new and better munitions, which they may provide to the Soviet Union, but which they will also keep for themselves. So there's a massive military-industrial complex in North Korea. There's a massive separate shadow economy that is based on the military-industrial complex that is separate from the consumer economy. We just hear about the consumer economy, but there's a massive military-industrial economy that is also benefiting greatly from this new relationship between DPRK and Russia.
Yeah, Michael, I don't want to forget you're there, and I know you always ask great questions, so please feel free to jump in whenever you want. And also to our audience, remember Q&A at the bottom, and we'll go another 15 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to Q&A.
Well, thank you, Jill, because you're always very kind in including me. And we started with the long relations between North Korea and the Soviets. In the case of China, for example, there were great cultural attraction on the part of China that then got wrecked by the Cultural Revolution, but now can be kind of resurrected. In the case of Syria, there's a lot of intermarriage, Russian-Syrian, that can be drawn on, and as well as Middle Eastern experts. I'm just interested from the point of view of inside North Korea, what information there might be on the kinds of attraction or this new relationship. How can that be manifested, and more specifically than just saying it's a deep relationship? I'm curious to see if there's anything that we know about that.
I mean, there is certainly a deep relationship historically, in the sense that during the Cold War, North Korea was very much benefited from and was a part of the Soviet bloc. North Korean leaders had good relationships with the East German leader, with the Romanian leader. The first leader, Kim Il-sung, actually used to vacation with Erich Honecker and Ceausescu. And North Korean elites would, when they would travel and they would go to the Soviet Union, they'd go to Moscow. And so they had a whole world, in which they could participate and operate. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990, that stopped. And North Korea, as Jill said, really closed in on itself and had really no particular friends and neighbors. They had, as we can talk about, they had certainly had some in the Middle East that they kept close, including Iran and Syria, which then led to connections with Hamas and Hezbollah. But in terms of the Soviet Union, there were very, very little. The second leader of North Korea was actually so upset by Soviet and Chinese normalization with South Korea that there were virtually no summit meetings that took place for almost a decade while Kim Jong Un was the leader of the country. Instead, they focused on their nuclear program, and we've seen the results of that. What the current improvement in relations will mean in terms of broader economic relations, people to people. I think it's still very difficult to say. This is very much of a marriage of convenience, an elite marriage of convenience that may trickle down, but still, at least on the North Korean side, travel is still very much restricted. While they're not in a lockdown per se, it's not like people travel a lot to North Korea, and even now, it'll be hard for Russians to travel to North Korea because there still are health and safety precautions that are there. So,
and Victor, could you walk us through some of the technical part of North Korea's striving to get high tech from Russia? Because I guess I have a couple of questions. They are more sophisticated than we understand, or many of us understand. What exactly do they need? And also, why can't they get that from China? Russia already is hurting because of sanctions against high tech from the West. So why not just turn around and go to China?
So that's interesting. So the interesting thing there is that, China has been very supportive of North Korea over the years and the decades, but they have been very reluctant to provide technology to China, to North Korea. It doesn't mean they haven't provided any, but if you compare them, the Soviet Union has provided much more, right, to North Korea.
Russia had it.
And so what we're talking about now in particular is the first thing is, so North Korea has been wanting to put military satellites into orbit. The Western intelligence takes pictures of North Korea all the time because we can't get into the country. We even at CSIS use commercial satellite imagery to take pictures. Everybody's taking pictures of North Korea. And so they want to take pictures on their own. So they've been trying to put a military satellite into orbit. They failed on 2 occasions prior to Kim meeting with Putin. And then they succeeded, right? And so some of you may have seen in the news, the North Koreans boasting about how they're now taking pictures of the White House and of Indo-PACOM and of the Pentagon and things of that nature. So that is one area where we believe the Russians have helped. The other is that North Korea aspires to have the second leg of the nuclear triad, which are submarine-launched ballistic missiles. And they have some very noisy submarines that they've refurbished with multiple rocket launch tubes, missile launch tubes on them. But it's very clear that they want to have a nuclear submarine capability, right? And their justification is they point to things like AUKUS, right? The Australia, UK, US collaboration on nuclear submarines for Australia. They point to US nuclear submarines and they say, we want to have that capability too. And their refurbishment of their old submarines are, the most obvious physical manifestation that they have a program here that they're trying to build. It's not by coincidence that when Kim went to Russia, like he observed the Soviet Pacific Fleet, right? When you organize summits, whether they are in Washington, D.C. or in Moscow, these places they pick don't happen by accident, right? They are for a purpose. And then the third element is ICBM technology. North Korea is trying to develop an ICBM technology that can reach the United States, and more importantly, that can also deploy countermeasures that can confound our ground-based interceptor system. And so that is where they are also, I think, looking for help from the Russians. So these are all very bad things. They are not good things for the United States. And so this goes beyond simply being supplying arms to Russia for the war in Ukraine. And I'm sure Putin actually takes satisfaction in that, right? That this transaction is also confounding U.S. homeland security and our extended deterrence with our allies.
Yeah, there's a great question. I wanted to go to it because it's kind of connected. I was actually going to ask a similar question. Harley Balls are asking it more elegantly than I was going to, but he says at the ATSI's meeting last week, one former NSC expert said that Russia is now the supplicant, not only in relations with China, but also North Korea. Do you agree? I was going to say, who needs who more? But what do you think, Victor?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of proximate need, clearly the Russians need the North Koreans. I mean, this is unprecedented in the history of the relationship. As I said, North Korea is usually always the one that's begging for things from the Soviet Union, Russia, but very clearly, right, they need this ammunition, and North Korea is about the only place that they can get ammunition in volume, right? We're talking about volume, right? The White House said it's like thousands of shipping containers of munitions that are going to Russia, and they go through Najin port, and then they make this long train ride across Russia to the front in Ukraine. So in that sense, definitely the North Koreans are in a better position. They are arguably also in a good position with regard to China, because one of the things that the Chinese don't like is they don't like when the North Koreans get too close to Russia, right? And Xi Jinping really has no particular affection for Kim Jong Un. He thinks he's kind of a spoiled kid, right? A spoiled brat. In the first, I think the first few years of Kim Jong Un's role, Xi Jinping would not actually meet with the North Korean leader. He did not meet with him until Donald Trump announced that he was going to meet the North Korean leader. And then Xi Jinping did 5 summit meetings with Kim Jong Un. When the Trump diplomacy all blew up and failed, and there looked like there was no prospect of North Korea having a relationship with the United States, Xi Jinping stopped meeting with Kim Jong Un. Now, Kim Jong Un has a relationship with Putin, right? So Xi Jinping is going to court Kim Jong Un now. So in that sense, to Harley's question, North Korea is in this position where they've gone from a failed summit with the United States, complete isolation under COVID, now to a position where they occupy this pivot between Russia and China, which is extraordinary, right? And it's extraordinary, and it largely it is all derivative of the war in Ukraine.
Can I follow up on this question of China? Because the bigger issue is whether this can become sort of an anti-Western, anti-American triangle. But China can't be too pleased with, the military technology, highly destabilizing, right, for that region being provided. And is that a potential wedge for this nascent triangle?
Yeah. So it's a great question, and the answer is not clear, right? The answer is not clear at this point. When the Chinese are asked about it, they give the standard sort of pat foreign ministry response, which is, that's a bilateral issue between DPRK and Russia, and we have nothing to say on it, right? So that's what they say. But I would imagine there is a debate, to the extent that debates happen under Xi Jinping, that is taking place in China. Because on the one hand, as you say, Michael, this is not a good thing for China, right? This is not a good thing for China, because it will just, if North Korea gets more capabilities from Russia, it just means the US, Japan, Korea, the Philippines, Australia are just going to sort of, amp up their capabilities. So you just get a full-fledged arms race in China's neighborhood, which they can't see as being positive. On the other hand, like I said, they don't want to alienate North Korea. They don't want to lose control and influence over North Korea. And there's probably a third group within China that says, no, this is good. Like, if this makes life difficult for the United States, we want to show them that when US-China relations are bad, that this leads to bad things with the United States and North Korea. So I think there's a third argument there as well. But which of these, emerges is unclear right now. The Chinese have not done anything, and they've certainly not criticized this DPRK Russia relationship.
Mm-hmm. And Victor, some of the things that I was reading that you have written about are actually different from what I was focusing on, and very interesting. For instance, Moscow's interest in warm water ports on the Korean Peninsula for its Pacific fleet, and then also energy transport infrastructure projects that connect Northeast Asia to Siberia and then Eurasia through the Korean Peninsula. There's a lot of geopolitics and actually geographical politics going on here. Can you tell us some about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think in that sense, while what we're talking about now is very transactional between Putin and Kim, Russian sort of strategic interests on the peninsula have been remarkably consistent for centuries, right? They've been remarkably consistent for centuries. One of them is that North Korea is the closest place for the Korean Peninsula, is the closest place for them, for the Soviets, whether we're talking about in the 20th century or the 19th century, to have access to 365-day a year warm water ports, right? That it's probably not that warm, but in the sense, not frozen over and during any part of the year, right? And that access to that in the Korean Peninsula is valuable to Soviet Russia power projection in the Pacific.
Soviet or Russian?
So during the Soviet era as well.
Oh, okay.
And then also for Russia as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the energy side, Russia, the Soviet Union was unsuccessful in the 1970s at gaining massive Chinese investment in Siberia. And so they've always looked to the Korean Peninsula as a possibility to connect, right? To connect an energy grid that runs from the Russian Far East down through down through the Korean Peninsula that could then service as far as Taiwan and across the sea to Japan. And they always thought of Korea as possibly doing this because they tried with Japan in the 1970s. It was unsuccessful. So they thought if they could get it going with Korea, that would also then cause Japan to want to become involved in that as well. So this sort of energy, and then for the North Koreans, that they would basically get rents from these pipelines, right? These pipelines would go through the Korean Peninsula down to the south and through the port of Busan, and then be able to be shipped everywhere else. So that has always been there. And then a third has been, more recent, has been triangular trade among Russia, North Korea, and South Korea, where Russia would excavate North Korean coal, because North Korea has large coal deposits, and then would ship them to South Korea as a Russian export. To try to create sort of triangular energy, obviously not climate friendly, triangular energy cooperation. So there have always been these kind of interests with regard to energy and with regard to port access that the Russians have had traditionally with the Korean Peninsula.
Mm-hmm. Do we know anything about North Koreans in Russia per se? I know occasionally you have these reports of groups of them doing certain projects. They're always living in their own dorms, very cut off, et cetera. Do you have any clarity on some of that?
Yeah, so it's largely, I mean, we talk about it largely in the context of North Korean human rights abuses and transnational repression. About 30% of workers that North Koreans send overseas go to Russia, 30% go to China, and then 30% go elsewhere in the world, often to the Middle East. And so this is considered transnational repression because these workers go there not by choice. They're sent there. They don't collect the wage. The wage goes back to the government. They're not allowed to travel. They're not allowed to have contact with the family. They're not allowed to come home until they're told to come home. So as I said, 30% of them are in Russia. And what the focus has been on lately is with the COVID lockdown, these people were basically displaced workers because they could not return home. Their work visas had expired, and they had no place to go. So they have become obvious targets of trafficking, whether it's labor trafficking or sex trafficking. And, so this has been a huge issue both in China and in Russia. There are standing UN Security Council resolutions that call for UN member states to reject North Korean slave labor, but clearly that is not the case in Russia or in China.
Mm-hmm. I want to remind the audience that any questions, we're now open to questions, and you can put them in the Q&A function. I'll be monitoring that here. And could we return to this, one of the original ideas, Victor, about armaments, weapons, et cetera, and pay attention to the Middle East, because there are reports about supposedly in Gaza, Hamas using some North Korean, at least arms and I should say ammunition and weapons. And usually, this is not sophisticated stuff. This is, pretty primitive, but it's very useful. What's the role right now in the Middle East conflict?
Yeah, so this is a big concern. I think you're right. I mean, the type. So for the audience, I mean, there are reports that they are finding, North Korean-made weapons in the possession of Hamas, in the fight in Gaza. Right, it's not like high-tech stuff. It's like rocket launchers, artillery shells, rifles, MRLS, multiple rocket launch systems. There's been talk, but no one's actually seen sort of anti-tank capability. But this is a relationship that goes back for quite some time. It's derivative of North Korea relations with Iran and Syria, particularly with Iran with which North Korea has had a long-standing relationship in terms of cooperation on ballistic missiles, but also with Lebanon, Hezbollah, and Yemen, Houthi rebels. What is not clear right now is whether the weapons, North Korean weapons that are being found in the fight are actually being directly delivered by North Korea, or they're coming through transfers that came through Iran. In other words, North Korea transfers weapons to Iran, and then without North Korean knowledge, they get transferred from Iran to Hamas. First point, though, is that, again, this is very transactional. North Korea will sell weapons to whoever needs them. And the thing about sort of inadvertent transfer, right? The whole issue with inadvertent transfer, and why I'm more skeptical of inadvertent transfer, is that the North Koreans could easily sort of say, look, we don't know how those weapons ended up there. Like, yes, we sell them to Iran, we sell them to Syria, but like, we don't have any control over who they go to after that. They could say that, right, to stay out of this, but they haven't, right? Instead, they have fully backed Hamas, right? They have, they have called Israel an aggressor and an imperialist state. They've been 100% behind Hamas, not acknowledging that they're transferring weapons, but 100% taking a political position, 100% behind Hamas. And again, given the history of the relationship with Hezbollah, Iran, and Syria, it shouldn't be surprising that they're doing this.
Yeah.
But the one thing that's, the one thing we have not seen in Gaza that we've seen in Ukraine is that, North Korean munitions to Russia have pulled the Korean Peninsula into the Ukraine war, because on the other side right now, the single largest supplier of munitions to the war effort in Ukraine, the single largest supplier right now, directly or indirectly, is South Korea, right? South Korea munitions support for the war in Ukraine now is more than all NATO allies combined.
Wow, I was not.
Yeah, yeah. And but so, what Kim is doing with Putin is pulling the Korean Peninsula into Ukraine. We're not seeing that yet in Gaza, right? The South Koreans have not sort of countered what we're seeing, in part because there is uncertainty about whether these weapons are being directly provided to Hamas or they are inadvertently ending up in Hamas's hands.
Mm-hmm. You had that kind of interesting note about how Xi Jinping looks at Kim Jong Un. Kind of a spoiled brat. I guess that's one way of looking at him, because he's a grandson, and the dynasty continues. But do we have an idea of how Putin looks at him, or at least maybe how Kim looks at Putin? What is that relationship?
Yeah, again, it's a great question. We don't have a lot of transparency into it. We can make some deductions about what's happened with Putin and past North Korean leaders. So the difference between the current leader of North Korea, Kim Jong Un, and his father, Kim Jong Il, is that his father, Kim Jong Il, was truly a recluse. I mean, he was a recluse in a hermit kingdom, as you said, Jill. So he was never photographed or filmed speaking publicly. In sort of this personality cult system, part of the regular propaganda is they show the North Korean leader going out and meeting with the people. They're called these spot visits that he will do, like to a farm, or to a textile factory, and he's seen sort of glad handing with the workers and all this stuff. The father never did any of that stuff. He was sort of a super recluse. Putin was the only leader who actually really tried to reach out to Kim Jong-il, really tried to reach out to him and befriend him on a personal basis. The reason for that, not clear. Maybe, again, it had to do with these broader interests in warm water ports, energy infrastructure, these sorts of things. But he really tried. There's this famous moment where in a summit meeting between Kim Jong-il, the father, and Putin, there was an official lunch that was on the schedule. And instead, Putin went off script and said, oh, let's skip this lunch. Why don't you come to my flat and let's have lunch together, right? Which Kim Jong Il just loved. I mean, he just loved that somebody would treat him like that. I would imagine that, I mean, Kim Jong Un, as I said, the son now is not like that. He's much more outgoing, gregarious. He's allows himself to be photographed at things with his wife, with his children, with his younger sister, at amusement parks, all sorts of things at the same time that he's talking about nuking the United States. But I would imagine that Putin also tried to treat him in a very positive way, very personable way, to build a relationship with him. And I imagine that the North Korean leader really liked that a great deal. Again, because he's getting the cold shoulder from Xi Jinping these days, and he completely bombed in his summits with Trump. So and there's no way that Biden's going to have a summit with him. So I'm sure that was something that Kim Jong Un liked. And he did offer a reciprocal visit to Putin, right, for Putin to come to North Korea. So I expect to see that happening as well.
Yeah. Let's see. Oh, we have another question. This is from Joseph Lee. And he says, Dr. Cha, thank you for this talk. What do you see as the future of American DPRK relations should Trump come back to power next January? Or I guess it would be 2025. But what would happen if Mr. Trump were back?
Well, I think it's hard to predict. We can only do it based on what we know. And it was very clear that when Trump came in, he tried to get very close to Putin, Xi Jinping, and Kim Jong Un. Right, those were sort of his three adversaries, if you will. North Korea, in particular, was a very proximate one at the time because remember there was this famous exchange between the incoming president and the outgoing president, in which President Obama said that the North Korea issue would really bubble up on his plate during his time in office. And we saw North Korea did 20 ballistic missile launches during Trump's first year in office. So, but Trump's response to this has always been to try to, I don't know if engage is the right word, but try to build relationships with these leaders. And I expect he would do the same thing again. I am almost certain that if Kim Jong Un, Xi Jinping, and Putin could vote in our election, they would be voting for Donald Trump. They would not be voting for Joe Biden. At the same time, though, the relationship, the summit diplomacy that took place in the first term of Trump failed spectacularly, right? It really failed very badly. But it wouldn't be surprising to me if Trump tried to pick up the mantle again, particularly if the North Koreans were acting up. If they were acting up, deploying nuclear submarines or testing more ICBMs, it wouldn't be surprising to me if Trump tried to do that. But my guess is that the North Koreans, if Trump were to win, would remain silent for at least 6 months to first see what the U.S., sort of predictable beginning of any administration policy review would turn out on North Korea, and then would decide what their next move is. I don't think there's any prospect for anything happening between the U.S. and the DPRK in the remainder of the Biden administration because the North Koreans are not happy with Biden because he hasn't been solicitous of North Korea like Trump, and also because they know there's an election coming up. So there's no reason to start anything now. They're going to wait to see the results of the election.
Yeah, and also, during the Trump administration, I think some of that was the Summitry was window dressing. It was emotional. Here is this guy, kind of a loose cannon, setting off weapons, and even Trump's stepping over the border, that type of thing. A lot of theatrics, but really behind it, I'm not quite sure what the United States would even think about giving to North Korea.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. There was, Trump loved the theatrics. He loved all of the summitry in the sense that it made for great TV, right? Like I think somebody described, like, I remember I was covering the summit for NBC News, the first summit in Singapore for NBC News, and people were like, this is the Super Bowl, right? This is like the Super Bowl of diplomacy, right? The first meeting between a North Korean leader and a US president. But Trump really, focused on the theatrics. And I think both leaders felt like they had the other one in a box, or both leaders were briefed to believe that they had the other one in a box, in the sense that Trump had all of his problems at the time with Michael Cohen coming out and all these sorts of things. And then Trump was, led to believe that the North Koreans, were in a desperate situation. They needed food, they needed energy, they needed all these things. And so I think both of them came to these meetings enjoying the theatrics, but believing that it would be an easy deal. And then when it wasn't, they were not really prepared to negotiate, right? They were not, prepared. Like when Reagan and Gorbachev met at Reykjavik, they had to figure out what to do when they could not get the deal. They had to negotiate. Not that I'm comparing Kim Jong Un and Donald Trump to Reagan and Gorbachev, but they were not ready, right? They were not ready to hash out a deal, and so the whole thing fell apart.
Mm-hmm. That raises a question too, not to get too into the psychology of this, but Vladimir Putin, for all of his faults, sometimes has a rational side, and it must be difficult to deal with a very unpredictable Kim Jong Un. I mean, you never quite know what he's going to do. Granted, Russia right now is a bit over the barrel because it needs North Korea. But it reminds me of, from the Russian perspective, Putin likes to balance people and kind of, keep them off balance, and maybe let people go as far as they can, but continue to kind of control the situation, ultra right, ultra left, et cetera. But with Kim Jong Un, what control ultimately would Putin have over Kim Jong Un? What if Kim Jong Un just decided he was angry at Vladimir Putin? Or that's ridiculous, but let's say that he had some interest in making life difficult for Vladimir Putin. What would Putin be able to do about it?
Yeah, I mean, right. I mean, in the past, there was a lot they could do, in the sense that they could cut off the energy, or they could cut off the assistance. But like I said, right now, Putin needs Kim, arguably more than Kim needs Putin, at least in terms of proximate needs. He needs Kim a lot more than Kim needs Putin. But the other thing, though, I think is that there is, and I think the other thing is, I think that the biggest negative externality from this cooperation is what it will do in terms of the way allies in the region will respond. Japan, South Korea, even as far down as Australia and the Philippines, in the sense that they will see this as a security threat, and they will seek to develop more capabilities to try to counter that threat. But it's an open question of whether that matters that much to Putin, because while Xi Jinping should certainly see this as happening in his neighborhood, it's not clear that, whether Putin really sees this as a threat to his neighborhood. And so what I'm saying is, I think that it's impossible for Xi Jinping to decouple what is happening between Russia and North Korea from the military situation in the region. And I ask it as a question, is it possible that Putin can decouple and say that, what is happening between Russia and DPRK has negative manifestations for the region, but that region is not something that is of as primary concern to Putin as it is to Xi? I don't know the answer to that question, but I think calculations are driven much more by this proximate need than by anything else. I mean, I do think the North Koreans still need food and fuel, and that they would still provide munitions for that food and fuel. But if the Chinese start to counter by substituting that food and fuel for the Russians, which the Chinese could do, then it would be very hard for Putin to titrate the other stuff, right? The military technology and everything else, because then the North Koreans would stop providing munitions. right?
Yeah.
If the North Koreans are if the North Koreans are dependent on Russia for food and fuel and military technology, then Russia holds has more cards. But if North Korea can displace that and get support from China on food and fuel, then the relationship is different, right, between Russia and DPRK.
That's really fascinating, Michael. I'm thinking you look as if your brain is functioning there very
Well, I'm learning
fast.
a lot from this, and
It's
this
really
has really been fascinating.
Yeah,
I think that, from my perspective, there's a potential domestic political ramifications in Russia because elites can't be overly happy with Russia's new relationship with both China and North Korea, but that's a very murky realm that it's not easy to access. But I'm also kind of wondering on the US side, the far-reaching ramifications of all of this new alliance that we've been talking about for such a long time. How aware, how much of this is registering in the debate on the Ukrainian war? I mean, inside Russia, that new dependency with people that countries that Russians really look down on in terms of their cultural superiority complex, right, is galling, but it's offset by kind of sticking it to Europe and the United States in the war on Ukraine. But in the US, we've just seen that, there's been aid to Ukraine was turned down for basically domestic political reasons and polarization. And how much of these far-reaching sort of geostrategic stakes that are going on are reaching into the debate about aid to Ukraine? That's on my mind.
Victor?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I obviously don't have the answer to that. I mean, like you said, these are being driven by two different things, right? I mean, the decision on support for Ukraine is being driven here by domestic politics. And partisan politics. It's not being driven by, hey, look at how this is helping, North Korea. Look how it's hurting our position in the Indo-Pacific. Look how it's creating this new relationship between DPRK and Russia. Frankly, I think that's the least of the considerations when they're making votes on Ukraine. I think within the policy-making establishment of the U.S. government, they're very concerned about these sorts of things, in part because there isn't a really good play, if you will. We have very little influence over North Korea, and we have very little influence over Russia. And the only way we can stop Russia DPRK military technology cooperation is to look to China, right? And our relationship with China is in a different place right now. So it's not it's a real dilemma, I think, for the United States, at least in terms of this particular issue. On the Russian domestic society view of this, the potentially negative view, as you just described, you know this better than I do, but I think that's one of the reasons why, at least from a U.S. perspective, the sort of I'm not going to say disinformation, but the characterization of this, rather than publicly fretting about, oh, this is really bad, this cooperation, the administration has taken it and moved it in the direction of, well, Russia is really scraping the bottom of the barrel now. Like, if they've got to go to North Korea for munitions, that says a lot about Putin. That says a lot about the Russian military, right? All these sorts of things. So I think I didn't really think about it in those terms until you mentioned it. But I think that there was a purpose to saying that, aside from deflecting any hand-wringing about how the United States is worried about this cooperation.
Yeah. And, Michael, domestically in Russia, I'm just trying to think, probably the average person on the street doesn't think a lot about North Korea. The country needs weapons and ammunition. We've got to get it from somewhere. But I do agree that there's that deep level of, you could almost say, racism that exists. And so I keep thinking, what are they thinking at the foreign ministry? That to me must be pretty galling that your best friends now are Iran, although, arguably big country, influential, but Iran and North Korea are your best buddies right now. So I think for Russian foreign policy, they always try to put a positive spin on it, but it must be really pretty sad to see Lavrov's, outreach to both of those countries. But then this is it's a transactional war by Putin. He will do what he needs, and he appears to have convinced people that this is what has to happen. So there's a lot of apathy and then acceptance, kind of mute acceptance of what Putin wants to do. Yeah.
But in addition to that, like, the long-term consequences of this, right, are extremely bad for Russia, right? In the sense that, I mean, countries like Japan, like big economies like Japan and South Korea now are actively looking for ways to decrease their energy dependence on Russia, right? Whether it is sort of new strategic energy relationships with other countries, maybe in the Middle East, but even with the United States, right? Looking for new sort of energy relationships so that they can forever decrease this dependence, this vulnerability to Russia. In the past, the way these countries would respond to Russian sanctions is that they would publicly be critical of Russia, but then they would then look to the United States and look for exemptions, right, from the sanctions on oil imports or things of that nature. I think, there's an understanding now in the region that the game has completely changed. This is not a temporary thing that will go back to normal in the future, and that they need to find alternative supplies, which again, in the long term, is very bad for Russia. And I imagine those in the foreign ministry understand that, right? But Japan and South Korea are very important for Russia economically. And those relationships are just, I think they're finished, right, going forward. So,
well, really good point. And then in Europe, of course, you have Europe slowly but surely going green, and so that's a decrease in the energy coming from Russia. So yes, this could definitely be backfiring for Putin. And we've had so many conversations about the fact that the war has backfired. So we'll see. Unfortunately, with that vote on the Hill, it's a lot more complicated. And sadly, nobody is paying attention to the implications of this geopolitically. It's a little disturbing, but that, I guess, is another subject. Victor, did you have any closing thoughts that you wanted? We're running up to the end of the hour. Anything that we should be watching? I always like to ask that question. Things that are coming down the tracks at us that maybe we don't know about.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, well, first, thank you for this discussion. It was great. It was very substantive, and I enjoyed it. Very much. I mean, I think, at least from the Indo-Pacific North Korea perspective, the thing I'm looking at is North Korea continued advances in military satellite capabilities, nuclear submarines, and ICBMs, right? Because these are the things that have the biggest implications for the United States in terms of homeland security and our commitments, our nuclear umbrella to our allies, right? If North Korea can develop a submarine ballistic missile capability that can make their nuclear weapons, survivable for a first strike, that really raises concerns for allies. So that's the first thing. And then the second, much more proximate thing, is the national security advisors of Japan, the United States, and South Korea are meeting this weekend. And this is part of a regular new trilateral meeting. I'm sure they'll talk about China, but I'm sure they're going to be talking about this DPRK-Russia relationship as well, and to see if there's anything they say coming out of those meetings about that.
Wow. Well, yes, I agree. Fantastic discussion. Thank you very much. I learned a lot. Really appreciate it. Michael, thank you very much. And so again, Victor Cha, read what he writes. He really knows what he's talking about, obviously, and read his latest book. And thank you very much, Victor, and thank you to our audience for the questions. And also thank you to the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies here at Georgetown, and finally, the Carnegie Corporation of New York for all of its really valuable support. Thank you, and we'll see you
Thank you, Victor.
Thank you very much. Happy holidays.
Same
Yes,
to
you
you.
too.